Okay, good evening, folks. Welcome. Tonight, I'm going to be talking about the beginning, origins, Genesis, and in particular, I'm going to compare and contrast creation as it's accounted in the Bible with theories of evolution. And my objectives for you is so that you can be equipped to speak truth to the lies. A lot of lies out there, and I'm going to cover what some of those are and what their effects are. And we see that all around us in the world today. Now, to start with, there are a lot of social issues, and it all has to do with what's the truth. And if the first chapter of God's book is wrong about first things, then who's to say what the last book is? The last book credible? And we see euthanasia, lawlessness, homosexuality, all the woke stuff, creation versus evolution. But creation and versus evolution is not really a side issue. Go to the next slide, please. The problems facing society, abortion, pornography, lawlessness, all have to do with the same foundations. Next slide. Is it evolution that's the foundation for our thinking, or is it creation? And those that support evolution and those that support all of those social problems that we see know what to attack, and that is the foundation, the biblical foundation of creationism. And a lot of Christians and others are taking pot shots at each of those individual problems when the real place that we should be aiming our criticism and so forth is the foundation. The wrong foundation, the one of evolution. Boy, I have just enough of those right now. Okay, on the worksheet there you see Matthew 24:11, even the elect will be deceived. So a lot of what's happening has to do with deception. Many people want to be deceived. And then we see in Romans 1:20, for the invisible things of him from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are or were made, even his eternal power and Godhead. So they are without excuse. So if you actually look at creation and study it, you're not going to fall into the trap of all that happened by accident. And we have two books that tell us so. One is Scripture, Genesis, and the rest of the Bible, and nature. If we look at nature scientifically, we're going to come up with the right conclusions. So the issues in society have to do with the foundation. In Psalm 11:3, if the foundations be destroyed, what can the righteous do? I didn't have any blank for that, but it's Psalm 11, verse 3. If the foundations be destroyed, what can the righteous do? So creation and evolution are not side issues. And they have to do with, what does anything ultimately mean? Go to the next slide, please. There is a lot of debate among creationists as well as evolutionists as to what the correct theory or explanation is. I use several of these Far Side cartoons that were created by Gary Larson, who was a psych and social major in college, and he pursued this endeavor of making cartoons. Most of them have to do with something in psych or soc, and the debate concerning creation. He was a young earth creationist himself, and he has a lot of fun poking holes into the evolutionary theories. Next slide. Okay, here we have 4 unscriptural views concerning creation. And I want to say that if a person believes in any one of these, it doesn't mean that they can't be saved. It doesn't mean that they're not true believers in Jesus Christ for their salvation. It's just that they're off, in my opinion, and I think I can demonstrate that. The first one, evolution, has to do with the idea of a big bang starting everything, and that mutations along the way have brought about changes. Natural selection plus time changes the DNA code, which allows for the advancement of animal species and humans from lower forms of life. One of my criticisms there would be that mutations, whenever they occur, and I'll demonstrate that with some examples later, cause the loss of information, not the gain of information. When there's a loss of information, most of the time there are problems. Natural selection is really the enemy of evolutionary theory. Okay, the second one, theistic evolution, right away we have a conflict of terms there. If it's theistic, it isn't evolution. But the idea that God accepts evolution and that God has used evolution. Now, I will later clarify that there's macroevolution and there's microevolution, and microevolution does have to do with natural selection, where there are different species within kinds, but one species does not develop into another kind, and I'll elaborate on that. The third one is very popular. It's the gap theory. Now, this theory, the idea that there's a time, there's a gap between Genesis 1, verse 1, and Genesis 1, verse 2. And some gap theorists say it might be 1,000 years, others say it could be millions of years, that there were vast civilizations and they collapsed, and the dinosaurs lived during that time, and then they went extinct, and so forth. So there is a belief that civilization of some kind predates Adam, and that is supposedly going to explain a lot of the fossil evidence in the different layers. This theory came about before Darwin, before Charles Darwin. This was in the early 19th century. The big problem with this, which I'll illustrate at the bottom of this page, is that there was a lot of death, destruction, suffering before Adam and Eve. Secondly, there's no verifiable evidence of this at all. Then there's the day-age theory. This is where each day that's talked about in Genesis is a long, long time period, maybe 1,000 years long, not just a 24-hour day. Now, I'll demonstrate in Scripture that that's not the case. One example, in day 4, land and vegetation was created. This was before the sun and the moon and the stars. So if it was a 1,000-year-long day, plants would have had to exist without the sun for 1,000 years. And we know that plants can't survive without photosynthesis. That's how they produce food, and they need sunlight for that. Now, there was light at the beginning on the first day, but there are those kinds of conflict. Another one is that sea creatures like whales were created on day 5, but cows were created on day 6, according to Genesis, and the evolutionists say that cows somehow went back into the ocean and evolved into whales, which is inconsistent. So if we look at the bottom of the page there, we see the non-literal view, particularly the gap theory, but also you could apply it to the day-age theory, that there was creation, millions of years perhaps, or thousands of years of death and suffering. Then Adam and Eve were created because God made some kind of mistake and had to start over again with Adam and Eve, and then they fell. But that didn't have any effect on sin, death, or suffering, because that already had existed for thousands of years. So it just doesn't make sense, resulting in the idea that death and suffering is all God's fault, and it comes from someplace before Genesis. Also, if we did evolve from a lower life form and everything is naturalistic, then human beings don't have any rights. There's no such thing as human rights. The foundation of human rights has to do with biblical creation. If we're just animals, we don't have rights. Rights are an immaterial concept, and if everything is material and naturalistic, it doesn't make any sense for anybody to have any kind of rights. Okay, going on to the next slide, please. Okay, here's another issue. That's not a far side, but I thought it was appropriate. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, here again, it's what I talked about on the bottom of page 1. I just got out of sync with myself. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, that's something to think about. Okay, starting with the first verse in the first book of the Bible. In the beginning, time, God created the heaven and the earth. The heaven is space, and the earth matter. Space would be length, width, and height. The fourth dimension would be time. And this statement, the first verse of the Bible, is factual and it's literal, and there isn't any scientist that would disagree with this. The scientists, even the evolutionists, know that this is literal. There's no debate about this. And the reason is that time, space, and matter must come simultaneously. That's one of the blanks there if you're following. Time, space, and matter must come simultaneously. If matter, but no space, where would you put it? If there's matter and there's no space, where would you put it? If matter and space, but no time, when would you put it? Okay, so it cannot occur independently. They must occur simultaneously. And if they're created, only a person could do that. And that person, because somebody had to make a decision for it to occur. Impersonal forces cannot choose to create or do anything. Only a person, some type of intelligence, can do that. And by the way, that's where most evolutionary scientists are today. They do know that there's some type of intelligence that designed everything, and DNA supports that, and we'll get to that, because it's just mathematically impossible for life to exist going from immaterial in some form of goo and then becoming life. It's just mathematically impossible. So what created everything must be spaceless, timeless, immaterial, powerful, and personal. God, those are descriptions of God himself. Okay, next slide. Science, what is it? Science is useful. It's a tool. It's not in conflict with creation. Evolutionists and atheists would say believing in the Bible is not scientific. Well, that's incorrect. Science is a tool. Science makes predictions about the universe and the material world, even human behavior. And to be scientific, data has to be observed. It must be observable. It must be testable. And it must be repeatable. So if one scientist discovers something and does, through an experiment or through observation, somebody else has to be able to repeat that experiment or repeat the observation, or otherwise it isn't credible. Okay, it has to be tested. It can be peer reviewed. Okay, other scientists, other people reading the journal article then can go ahead and test it themselves before it becomes a fact. It has to be testable. It's not blind faith. Okay, going to the next slide, please. Okay, stay here now. Fossils exist in the present. Okay, so everybody can look at them. And the evolutionists have one theory as to when and how they existed before they were fossilized, the bones or whatever. And creationists have another opinion. What's interesting is that there are some recent finds of large dinosaurs, T-Rexes, in fact, out in, I think, Colorado or Montana, out in that area. There's a big fossil bed. And some of those fossils actually have blood and sinew and other tissue in them that could not have been there 50 million years ago or whenever the evolutionists said that they existed and then were fossilized. Some of the fish fossils, when they crack open the rocks, smell like fish and have actual tissue there in the rocks that are supposedly millions and millions of years old. So there's a lot of scientific evidence that's catching up with the Bible. So fossils exist in the present. It just depends on what worldview you have as to how you interpret that. Next slide, please. Okay, here we go. So looking at fossils, it depends on what input you have. Are you looking at it from a creationist view or evolutionary view, atheist view? That depends. Depends on the input. Next slide, please. The origin of nonsense. I'll tell you a little bit about Charles Darwin, who gets credit for most of the evolutionary ideas. He was not the founder of that. There are some old civilizations that believed in some type of evolution in India and other places in East Asia. Before Darwin himself, and his explanation, which turns out to be false, His own great-grandfather, Erasmus Darwin, wrote a book. Darwin wrote a book, Zoonomia. Zoonomia was the title of the book, and he wrote that in 1794, which was an explanation about evolution, how life came about from simple life forms and advanced into more advanced. Darwin just popularized the idea. And he looked at, when he went to the Galapagos Islands, he looked at finches and other animals and all the variety of finches, and he deduced that they evolved through natural selection. And that part of his idea was correct. They all came from one kind of finch and developed into different species of finch, but they're still finches. They're not crows. They didn't evolve into some other non-bird type of creature. So Darwin was only using what already exists. And you see the little cartoon on this page. Most people don't really want the truth. They just want constant reassurance of what they believe is the truth. And I don't have it on a slide, but Richard Dawkins, is he one of them that's up there? He's not one of them that's up there. But Richard Dawkins, who is an atheist evolutionist, said, quote, "We don't need evidence for evolution. We know it to be true." Okay, blind faith. And the same with these other groups, ACLU, the Humanist Association, Carl Sagan. By the way, Carl Sagan, on his deathbed, asked Christians to pray for him. He did the series, The Cosmos, and professed to be an atheist. I think he changed his mind when he was facing the reality of having to meet the Maker. Isaac Asimov, Darwin, Huxley, no religion in school except their religion. Okay, the next slide, please. And we go to the next page. Here we can see that atheism, the basis of it is that God does not exist. The influence is you can't consider creation because there's no God, and that's 100% bias. And then the agnostic, which means unknowing or ignorant, doesn't mean stupid. They don't care, they can't know, they don't know. So they conclude you must exclude the role of God, which is 100% bias. Then we have theism. God is deduced, God is just a thought, or it might be some other theistic belief like Islam. Influence could be no absolutes, 100% bias. And then we have what's revealed in the Bible. And a theistic Muslim would believe in literal creation as it's stated in the Bible. God has revealed to man what has happened. Absolute reference points, 100% bias. So the question isn't whether any of these views are biased, it's what bias is the best bias to be biased by. And I might even add to that, which bias serves culture the best, society and human well-being. Now, next, anybody want that longer? Okay, next, here we go. Dangers of evolution. You notice the skull and crossbones here is evolving. Next slide, there we go. Some evils of evolution. Nazism is the first one up there, solely based on evolution. By the way, Margaret Sanger, who is the founder of Planned Parenthood, greatly influenced Nazism. There's a whole video on that you could look up on YouTube. It's just totally racist, even to where Planned Parenthood today denies some of her founding concepts and so forth. You can look at where Planned Parenthood facilities are located, and you will see that it's very racist. The next one, racism itself is evolutionary in its origin and its idea. Darwin himself thought that very soon the white race, the Anglo-Saxons in particular, would be the existing race in the future, and all the other races would disappear because they weren't fit. Drugs are associated with that, abortion, of course, business methods, male chauvinism, and communism. There were two Soviet citizens, and one of them asked the question of the other, have we really achieved full communism? And the other fellow said, hell no, things are going to get a lot worse. Sorry for the expression, but that. Okay, the Barna Research Group, which is a credible research organization and it is biased towards Christianity and creationism, but they do legitimate research, doing a lot of polls like the Gallup company, has found that there's a loss of faith, particularly related to evolutionary ideas. Only 6% of adults, and this is a few years ago, only 6% of adults in the United States have a worldview. The most dominant view is syncretism, which is a mixture. If something is syncretism, it's a mix of ideas where people pick and choose what they want to believe, like theistic evolution. It's putting together things that are irreconcilable differences of beliefs that just don't make any sense, and they put them together. Then we have the deism plus feel good. Here we have the don'ts. Don't know and don't care if God exists. In 2011, about 12% of the US population would fall into that category. They don't know and they don't care. In 2021, they more recently did the same study, and 43% of Americans don't know and don't care. And what's more startling is that 43% of evangelical Christians today in the United States don't believe that Jesus is God. Yeah, can you go back? Okay, I'm just trying to illustrate the problems that these theories have created. They haven't really helped anything. They haven't made the world a better place. Another Russian story. I used to teach a whole 9-week unit on the Soviet Union. An old lady asked Gorbachev one day, who invented communism anyway? Was it a politician or was it a scientist? And Gorbachev responded, well, it was a politician. She said, I thought so. That explains why we have so many problems. If it was a scientist, they would have tried it out on mice first. And that brings us to the next page with Marx. Marx was not a scientist. He was a politician. He was an atheist. He said that communism begins from the outset with atheism. Communism, as fully developed, will be naturalism, which equals humanism. It's a little mixed up there because it's translated from German. Now, Darwin said, at some future period in the not very distant future measured by centuries, the civilized races of man, whites, will almost certainly exterminate and replace the savage races throughout the world. That was the quote I was referring to earlier. So you can see what his motivation is. I mean, he's already got this idea. The next person up there, Herbert Spencer, is very important in a lot of sociological theory about society and where society is going and where it's developing and so forth. And he said, if I'm not created, I'm an accident, and I am only answerable to myself, and whoever is stronger socially, economically, or politically. So it's the idea in society of survival of the fittest, not just in organisms, but in society itself and social classes and so forth, applying the theory to that. I want to tell you a little bit about Darwin, who visited a group of people on the tip of South America, the natives of Terra del Fuego. They don't exist anymore. They were a small group at the time, and Darwin was going and looking at different groups, trying to support his theory of evolution. And he said, oh, these folks live a simple life. They're very much like beasts. They have a very primitive language. They only have about 100 sounds in their language. You know, and they don't wear clothes and so forth. In the 1920s, missionaries, Christian missionaries, went down to these people, and they discovered, and they translated their language so that they could give them the gospel. And they found that these people were very moral. They were very sociable. They had respect for family life. They were monogamous. They had a complex grammar system in their language of more than 32,000 words. And they prayed to a supreme creator. Before the missionaries got there, they knew that there was a God and that he had created, and they were answerable to that God. We're going to meet some of those folks. Anybody want that longer yet? Okay, next slide, please. I want to share with you some of the evolutionists, what they created as, this is a fraud, what they created. And I remember having this in biology textbooks when I was in high school. This is embryonic recapitulation, and this was the top row there, set up by Haeckel, who was an evolutionist, and he was trying to show that human development prenatally, we went through a process from being a type of fish all the way to being a human, okay? And that's the top row. That's what he used. And he used a fish embryo, he used a salamander embryo, then a turtle, then a chicken, then a rabbit, then a human embryo. The real embryonic development you see there in the bottom row. So his forgeries are in the top row, and we see the actual human embryos in the same stage in the bottom row. And you can see that there's a big difference. And there are other forgeries and fakes and so forth. I'll get into some of those later. Okay, next slide. Here again, the meaning of life, standards, marriage, laws, they all have a foundation in creation. Even the natives of Terra del Fuego knew that. Ideas concerning abortion, pornography, homosexuality, lawlessness, woke, and so forth all have to do with evolution as the foundation. Next slide. And the strategy of the enemy has been to influence the idea of evolution. And you have these evolutionary termites. You can't quite see it, but they go underground and they're digging under the foundation of creation. And if that collapses, then the enemy is successful. Next slide. Now here we see the 6 days of Genesis, very briefly here. Day 1, there was light. This was before the creation of the sun, the moon, the stars. Okay, there was space, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. Actually, to try to find information about that, I went to the Air and Space Museum, and there was nothing there. Okay. Anyway. Okay, let's see. There is something in space, okay, and I'm going to talk about that, and it has to do with Albert Einstein's theory of relativity. Space is not empty, okay, there's something out there. And the Bible describes what that is. Day 2, water in the sky. Day 3, the land and vegetation before the sun. Then the luminaries on day 4. And day 5, the fish and the birds. And day 6, the beasts and humans. So cows did not evolve into whales according to Genesis. It's just out of order. Also, the evolutionists say that dinosaurs evolved into birds. Okay, there's no evidence of that. They keep trying to come up with that. Oftentimes you will see depictions of fossils that are, skin and so forth, and feathers and so forth are put on them, but that isn't what's found in the fossils. Although they have found some skin on some, even some woolly mammoths and so forth that died supposedly thousands and thousands of years ago have been frozen in the permafrost in Siberia, and it's thawing out, and they're digging them up, and you can actually eat the meat. And the people out there aren't eating it themselves, but they're feeding their dogs with it and other animals with it. It's it's just like taking something out of your freezer. Okay, here we go with the term that's used for day in Genesis, and it's yom. And yom is used in the Bible, the Hebrew word. It can be used for a day or a period of time. So those with the day-age theory argue that this yom could be 1,000 years or it could be longer. However, it depends on how it's used in Scripture. When it's used with a number, it always means a 24-hour day, if there's a number. And in Genesis, it says it was, after day 1, it was evening and morning in day 1, evening and morning day 2, evening and morning day 3, 6 times. Okay, it was like God knew that in the 21st century, people would need something to get them over that idea that a day is a longer period of time, an era, or the day of the Lord, or, it is used that way other times, but not with a number. When it's used with a number, it's always a 24-hour day. Now, if it wasn't that way, if it was 1,000 years being a day, then Moses lived 2,930 years in days 6 and 7. Anyway, I'm not sure if I have that. I don't remember how I organized that example. But in Exodus 20, verses 9 through 10, 6 days is avad. The 7th day is rest, which means desist. So you're supposed to, for 6 days, avad. And avad means to serve or work or worship. So for 6 days a week, we're supposed to worship by being God's representative. We're supposed to represent the name of God, carry the name of God for 6 weeks. And then 1 day, rest. Okay, and that's actually built into our physiological system that work weeks, even in Europe now they've got the 4-day work week. They're having trouble with that in Scandinavia. People come back after 4 days, they work for 4 days and they have 3 days off. That first day back is pretty much a waste. Okay, it's just like when you're off for Memorial Day or some other 3-day weekend, that next day that you go back to work, you're not at your peak. Okay, so they're thinking about going back to a 5-day work week with 2 days off. That's not too bad. Love the Lord your God. The Hebrew word there is avata, which means to love, and it's a form of avad, or serve, requiring action, okay? It's an action. It's not just mental thought. And most of the time, Hebrew involves action. Greek involves many times just thinking about something rather than actually doing something, taking action. And we know that even in the New Testament, Mark 2:27, the Sabbath is made for man. Okay, next slide, please. A little bit about H2O. Okay, that comes about early in creation. And what's interesting about the molecule H2O, it's made up of hydrogen and oxygen, 2 atoms of hydrogen and 1 atom of oxygen. It's very unique. And theoretically, H2O can be made into all the other elements. So when the Holy Spirit was hovering over the waters at the beginning of creation, that makes sense scientifically. Vibrations affect the water. And at Argonne National Laboratory, and when I was a kid, I could ride my bicycle to Argonne National Laboratory outside of Chicago. And they have an accelerator there. They also have a lab where they do experiments. They can actually suspend water and other liquids in the air with certain vibrations above and below. So when God spoke things into existence, that's a vibration. So the Earth starting out as water suspended in space makes sense scientifically. And there are videos concerning that. There isn't enough time tonight to look at those, but you can find actual videos on YouTube. I can steer you later if you're interested. They also use that in medical research where they suspend certain drugs to learn about the effect of drugs before they actually start producing them and prescribing them and so forth. Okay, we don't see the caption, but here we have the astronauts when they first got to the moon. They find Alice Crandon. Okay, now most of you won't remember who Alice Crandon is, but it was the wife of Ralph Crandon, played by Jackie Gleason, who would always, when he got frustrated with his wife, say, "To the moon." Okay, next slide. What they did find on the moon, they didn't find Alice, but when they stepped out, here we have a footprint. And you notice the dust is only an inch or 2 deep. Now, the Apollo mooning craft was designed to land in 15 feet of dust. They figured this, the evolutionary scientists figured there'd be at least 15 feet of dust on the moon. There wasn't. The moon's not that old to have accumulated 15 feet of dust. But they figured, you know, the millions of years that the moon supposedly existed, there would be that much dust. Meteorite dust falls on the Earth itself 14 million tons a year. You know, it's scattered all over the Earth, but there's meteorite dust that falls on the Earth. Now, if it had been falling for 4,500 million years, 4.5 billion years, there should be 182 feet of meteorite dust all over the Earth. There isn't. Okay, so the Earth could not have been that old, or the meteorite dust could not have been coming for that period of time. But anyway, next slide, please. Now, this is what macroevolutionists believe, what Darwin believed. This is the basic evolution tree, where we have simple life at the bottom and complex life at the top, branching off, apes branching off separately from humans. Evolutionists would say, oh, you silly Christians, we don't believe that humans evolved from apes, and they don't. They believe that apes and humans evolved from a different common ancestor. But they do believe in goo to you, in inorganic dust and chemicals came together in some type of primordial liquid goo, and then that somehow evolved into the earliest life forms. This is what we call macroevolution. Next slide. At the top here, we have this evolutionary tree that was more of a caricature, but it's here we have what evolutionists believe, that today all species are descended from one common ancestor at the bottom, and that evolved from a non-living chemical mixture. And that's what macroevolution is really about. Then they make fun of the creationist view of individual creation of species, which was the previous slide. But this is what creationists believe. True creationists believe in an orchard, and each beginning is a kind. So you have the dog kind, you have the cat kind, you have the bear kind, you have the elephant kind, which then branches off into woolly mammoths and the Asian elephant and the African elephant and the mastodon type elephants and so forth. And you have all the different varieties of animals and plants. Next slide. Here we see natural selection in operation with plants. You have all these different trees. Some have deep roots and some have shallow roots. They're the same kind. And then one species of the kind will become more dominant in a particular area depending on the environment. So if it's an arid environment, the trees that have the deepest roots are going to survive and the other ones are going to die out. Okay, so this is microevolution, or natural selection. And it's true for plants and it's true for animals. Next slide, please. Here we have dogs, okay, and we have one, they both have medium length fur. Okay, they have an L chromosome for long fur and an S chromosome for short fur. And then you have all the different possibilities as they mate: short fur, medium fur, long fur, and then the long fur dogs produce only long fur dogs. They don't produce medium haired dogs or short haired dogs unless they then mate with a long or a short haired dog or a medium haired dog. Okay, next slide. So we have all these different sizes and shapes for dogs, but they all are descended from one kind of dog, that was created, that was there in the garden and on earth initially. And then on the ark, when Noah took animals on the ark, he didn't take every single species. He took 2 of each kind. And then of the clean animals, he took 7 of each kind. Seven pairs, I believe it was. So microevolution is true. Natural selection is true. But natural selection is really the enemy of evolution. And here we see, you can't see the caption, but this is the true reason why the dinosaurs died out. The smoking. Actually, it does have something to do with their lungs. Okay, before the flood, many scientists believe that there was a dome around the earth. And then they argue and have eraser fights as to whether that dome was thin or whether it was a foot thick or whether it was 20 feet thick. But it was water vapor that was up there that formed a dome around the earth, and that filtered out a lot of harmful rays, a lot of radiation that affects us today. Like last Saturday, I was out in the sun too long without a hat on or anything and got burnt. Okay, that wouldn't have happened prior to the flood. Now the dinosaurs, according to the fossil evidence, had a very small lung capacity. And after the flood, that dome went away. It came down as rain for 40 days. Most of the water actually came out of the earth. And as a result, the big dinosaurs had trouble breathing, and they became extinct because of that. That's one explanation by the creationists. The actual scientists have proven that there is 3 times the amount of water that we have in the oceans under the earth today that once came up and covered the earth during the flood and then receded and went back down. But they, through all their seismographs and all that stuff, know that there's like 3 times the amount of water under the earth, under the crust of the earth. Okay, now here we have the evolution of normal sheep into the Ancon sheep. And there is an advantage to raising Ancon sheep. They can't jump over the fence as easy. It's easier to catch them when you want to shear them. But they come about through a mutation. And the mutation is not advantageous to the Ancon sheep. They can't get away from predators as easy as the sheep that have longer legs. And so, so it's not an advantage when there is a mutation which brought about that kind of sheep. It's an advantage to the sheep herder. Okay, next slide. Here we have the guy saying, honey, over here we can read it. Hey, I got news for you, sweetheart. I'm the lowest form of life on Earth. Okay, so evolutionists believe that the lowest forms of life were very simple. Okay, not so. Next slide. Now this is a drawing. However, it does show the complexity of a paramecium, which is a very simple life form. It has lots of different parts to it. This is a single-celled animal. And it has a mouth, it has an anus, it has a gullet, it has a nucleus with its DNA, it has the cilia, these little fibers on the outside that move around and allow it to swim from place to place. And you can only see this with a microscope. It's microscopic. But it's very complex. And these very simple one-celled organisms are about as simple as the New York subway system. Okay, they're not simple things, and their DNA is not simple. Which brings us to the next slide. DNA. Okay, DNA is at the cutting edge of proving the Bible. in all sorts of ways. So it's an acid, deoxyribonucleic acid. It comes in words. It comes in a code. There are 3 letters in each word in the code. These are molecules in groups of 3. I would argue here again are some fingerprints of the person who created it. Lots of 3s show up. You can't have DNA without RNA, and RNA allows DNA to operate. So you need coding in the DNA in the nucleus of any life form. You need to have RNA, which provides regulation and expression in the genes. And you need DNA to produce enzymes to form RNA. So you need DNA to produce enzymes to form DNA, and you need enzymes, it should be RNA, and you need enzymes. One cannot exist without the other. So if it evolved, how did that evolve? You know, it's the chicken and the egg. Which came first? Okay, the Bible tells us it was the chicken that laid the eggs. Okay, it was one unit to start with. So that's something that confounds the evolutionists now. Next slide, please. Okay, any day now we'll pick up a tiny regular signal, and then we'll know for certain that there is intelligence out there, because coded information doesn't arrive by chance. So we know there are some aliens out there someplace if we get a signal. And that's what the space program is trying to do. They're trying to look for alien life out there. Then we have the other scientists, both are evolutionists. The precisely coded information in each cell would fill many books, but we know for certain that no intelligence created life. Okay, you see the inconsistency? And in reality, most scientists who they don't say that they're creationists, but they do believe in intelligence design. Okay, it's not, if they say that or teach that, they'll probably get fired. Okay, there was even a professor in a Baptist university in Texas who was fired for saying that intelligent design is the reason for creation. Because the colleges, I don't have time to get into it, get accredited by organizations. Now there are some now that do accept creationist points of view, but most places don't. So they don't talk about that. They would be in trouble. They would lose their jobs. But it isn't what they believe. So they're looking, and many scientists are looking for aliens as the source of that genetic information. The Hindus believe that there was a cosmic egg that came to the earth thousands of years ago, and there was information in that brought about all the evolution of different life forms. So even they don't believe in goo to you. They believe that some type of intelligent information came to Earth and then developed into the different life forms. Okay, can we do the one video, Darwin's biggest problem? This explains a whole lot about why mathematics, the mathematicians, disprove evolution.
It's 1859 and there was this guy named Charles Darwin. He rode on a beagle to these islands and had a little idea. Just like humans can take the variety that they saw in animals and breed horses to be faster or dogs to be more hot dog-like, given enough time, old Charlie D figured nature could do the same thing and take even the smallest, slimiest of creatures and create the biggest, most baddest of T-Rexes. Nice. But there was one doubt that he couldn't shake, a problem that threatened to undo his entire theory. He Here's the story. Charles pretty well anticipated and answered most objections that were posed to his theory in The Origin of Species, but had some serious doubts about one in particular, the Cambrian fossils. Darwin expected very gradual change in animals and thus a smooth succession of fossils, but what the fossil showed was the opposite. There was a sudden appearance of wild new animals out of nowhere, and they remained essentially unchanged throughout the fossil record. This is a big problem. We're missing a ton of fossils. If we can't find them, it just could prove my whole theory wrong. The fossils don't agree with you, neener, neener, neener. Harvard paleontologist Louis Agassiz and other prominent naturalists wouldn't let him forget it either. Yeah, okay, you guys are right for now, but what if the fossil record is just incomplete? Don't worry, we'll totally find those fossils later. Boom, problem solved. So tons of younger naturalists, we're talking Joseph Hooker, Thomas Huxley, Ernst Haeckel, Asa Gray, they were convinced. Old coots like Agassiz just missed the boat. See you later, suckers. These Victorian naturalists didn't yet have the data or tools to explore the question much further, so they just held out hope that the fossils would turn up eventually and focus their efforts elsewhere. But that would soon change. The year's 1909 now, and along comes Charles Doolittle Walcott. He was hanging out up in Canada, digging holes, looking at rocks, when, dum-dum-dum, Chuck, I think I found something. Walcott found the Motherlode, an unprecedented trove of immaculately preserved Cambrian fossils. These didn't contain the precursor forms Darwin expected either. In fact, it only made the problem bigger, suggesting an even greater suddenness than Darwin even expected. Okay, so I know this looks pretty bad, but what if, get this, there really are tons of intermediate fossils, and we'll totally find those later, say, under the sea? Fantastic idea, Chuck. I'm sure it'll just sort itself out and won't be a nagging problem for decades to come. No siree. Back to work, boys. Hey Chuck, good news. We've invented these giant drills that can take samples from the sea floor. How about we finally find those pesky fossils we've been looking for? Awesome idea. Still nothing. I wonder what could be the problem. The answer wasn't under the sea either. The more they looked for the missing fossils, the more it confirmed Darwin's initial doubt. Some attempts were made to explain it, but they really fell short. Oh, I know. Maybe the Precambrian animals just didn't have enough hard bits that could survive the fossilization process. Those silly, squishy Precambrian animals, you know how they're so soft and squishy. Good news, everybody. We found some fossilized jellyfish. Isn't that cool? And sponges. Wow, how lucky of us. Okay, well, what if the fossils we're looking for, maybe they're just too small for us to see? That'd explain why we can't find them, because they're so teensy tiny. Oh, more good news, my dudes. We found fossilized bacteria. Isn't that so weird? What's wrong? Hey, look at this. DNA. Pretty cool, right? Ooh, swirly. Who needs fossils anyway? Pfft, what even are they? Rocks? Big deal. DNA. This is the key to evolution. Even though Darwin's elusive Precambrian fossils never turned up, the steady march of science progressed elsewhere, and it shored up the theory in the minds of its supporters. DNA in particular was giving up its secrets and provided a whole new insight into life. All the cool scientists were on board. Forget fossils, everybody knows evolution is a fact, and we all lived happily ever after. Oh no, what is this? Philadelphia, 1966. A bunch of math nerds got together and they started rocking the evolutionary boat. We're talking big wigs like MIT's Murray Eden, Harvard's Ernst Mayr, Richie Rich Lewontin, French mathematician Marcel Schutzenberger, and the one, the only, the Nobel laureate himself, Sir Peter Medawar. Okay, so you guys know this whole neo-Darwinian thing, it's not looking so hot right now. Animals need cells to function and do stuff, right? Right. And cells need little bits to do stuff, right? Yup. And those little bits need DNA to do stuff, right? Uh-huh. Well, maybe we should, I don't know, calculate the chances of that sort of thing happening. And they did just that. The field of computer science had come on the scene, and now that DNA was better understood, scientists were eager to see how easy or difficult it would be for the Darwinian mechanism to generate the information that DNA required to create new forms of life. Fossils or not, if the numbers showed that random mutation could make the simplest bits of life, then the biologists were confident that they've got a good shot at making the more complicated things. So these nerds did what they do best. They crunched the numbers and the results were tentative, but they didn't look good for the biologists. The mutational mechanism, as presently imagined, could fall short by hundreds of orders of magnitude of producing in a mere 4 billion years even a single required gene. They couldn't get the numbers to work for even the simplest building blocks of life, much less the whole animals that appeared in the Cambrian. While most scientists were still happy to accept Darwin's mechanism, skepticism was growing. After Wistar in the 1970s, young biologists could no longer ignore the geological record's lack of the expected Precambrian fossils. In time, the science developed to more accurately measure the likelihood of whether or not the neo-Darwinian mechanism could account for the Cambrian explosion. These experiments demonstrated that even on evolutionary deep time, the odds of random mutation and natural selection acting on DNA to make the animals in the Cambrian explosion were slim, to say the least. Early estimates pinned the odds at around 10 to the 90th to 10 to the 63rd. More precise, recent experimental results pin the number at 10 to the 77th. That is 1 chance in 100,000 trillion. Trillion, trillion. Trillion, trillion. Trillion. For random mutation in natural selection to generate just one single protein, much less than millions in a typical cell. Even evolutionary deep time is far insufficient. The simplest self-reproducing organism is so insanely complex that the amount of time needed for neo-Darwinianism to have a fighting chance vastly exceeds the most generous age of the entire universe. We're not talking Rocky odds or Mighty Ducks odds. We're talking an elderly one-legged turtle in the Kentucky Derby kind of odds. So evolutionary scientists today are more and more acknowledging that the neo-Darwinian model has proven simply inadequate in providing an answer to the question of life. The popular public-facing side of science does like to present a united front that all is well, but seeing so many problems mount and answers lacking, the Darwinian landscape has been broken up into a number of competing factions. And that brings us to today. These are all hotly debated and they do shore up some of the weaknesses of the standard model, but they all struggle to be viable for unique reasons of their own. Darwin's biggest problem about his theory over 150 years ago hasn't been allayed by recent science, it's only been amplified. If it's so difficult to prove what these scientists want to believe, why do so many cling to their presuppositions? That's a great question for another video.
Okay, now they're looking for aliens as a source, and that it's been shown that if you travel at the speed of light from the nearest planet that's not in our solar system, it would take, 500 years to get here at the speed of light. So any message going there or coming here wouldn't be detected by anybody that's alive. And the idea that UFOs, there are UFO means unidentified flying object, okay? 95% of those have been shown to be false. But there are 5% that have some credibility to them, and there's physical evidence from them. The idea that there's stuff out there in Area 51, that's a ruse that the government keeps perpetrating. There is real evidence that they have in some secret place in California, supposedly. The latest theory among those folks that believe in that is that the aliens travel through wormholes or other ways of getting here pretty much instantly. They just show up, like from another dimension. Well, I don't believe they're aliens that are coming out from another dimension and showing up and traveling around and so forth. I believe that that's demonic activity that's coming from the unseen realm, the other dimension, which I would argue is like the 11th dimension. Anyway, going on with a few more examples here having to do with time. If you have an hourglass, which has been used as a clock, and you can use it egg timer and so forth, it tells us the elapsed time by comparing the amount of sand at the top with the amount of sand at the bottom. But you have to make some assumptions, you know. How much sand was at the bottom to start with? Was there any added? Is it a constant rate of flow from top to bottom? You make assumptions. Now, if you have a little 3-minute egg timer, you can tell, okay? But theories concerning how old is the Earth are problematic in that you have to make a lot of assumptions. So, dating. One evening you come home from school and the bathtub is half full of hot water. It's at 50 degrees. And how long has the water been in the tub? Okay, now there are several theories. One, the water was boiling out of the tap and has cooled for a long time, down to the 50 degrees. Water was run into the tub at 75 degrees and is cooling, and the cooling occurred in about an hour. Or the water was in the tub for only 5 minutes because your mother knew what time you would come home and made it just the right temperature for you to take a bath when you got home. So which theory is right? There isn't any mathematical way that you can prove which of those theories is right. The only way you can find out is to ask your mother, when did she run the water? Okay, the same is true for evidence about temperature and the amount of salt that's in the ocean and so forth. You have to ask the person who put it there. Bishop Ussher figured that creation, using biblical sources, occurred about 4000 BC. And there's no observable evidence in astronomy to conflict with that. And there's one astronomer there, Dr. John Eddy, who's an evolutionist astronomer. Carbon-14 dating, just moving on here. This has to do with the amount of carbon-14 that an animal or other life form absorbed during its lifetime. And this theory assumes that the decay occurs at the same rate as it was at the beginning when it was first produced in the animal. Okay, so if you're looking at fossil evidence from before the flood, the amount of carbon-14 accumulating would be different because of the dome over the Earth. And as a result of the flood, just a side note, there was continental drift, and we have all the different continents coming from one large continent that existed biblically. And I believe in the restored Earth, all those continents are going to be pushed back together, and the Earth is going to shrink a little bit in size back to its original form, and that's why there isn't going to be any sea dividing any parts of the Earth. And you'll be able to cross land going any place. And in resurrected bodies, you just have to zip to another location, just like Jesus did as he met with his disciples and other people. Another dating method, radioactive dating, potassium-argon dating is the most popular one there. And this has to do with potassium degrading into argon. And this dating method, if it agrees with the evolutionists, they support it. If it disagrees, they don't talk about it and they don't report it to the public. Could you go back to the last one again? Okay, there are 5. The lava dome at Mount St. Helens, and I could see this place from where I lived in Washington when I lived out there, and I visited Mount St. Helens. I didn't do any research there, but I did visit there. Mount St. Helens blew up and became active again in 1980. And in 1993, Dr. Stephen Austin went to the crater that had erupted in 1980, and he took samples from the rock that was formed out of that volcano. Using the potassium-argon method, he looked at 5 samples, and they ranged from 340,000 years ago to 2.8 million years ago, even though they were created in 1980. Yeah. So you can see that there's some flaws in the potassium-argon dating method. Then the next slide, please. Another evolutionist in the 1830s came up with this geologic column that was talked about in the little video that we saw. And the reason that Lyell came up with this was, and this is a quote from him, to free science from Moses, to free science from Genesis, the Genesis account of creation. Rock layers do have fossils in them, and there are different kinds of fossils in the different kinds of layers. They argue that the ones at the lowest level were the earliest life forms that evolved to the higher life forms, but the higher life forms survived the flood longer than the ones that were already at the bottom of the sea, and they would be at the bottom level and so forth. It has to do with those columns that you find, like in the Grand Canyon. And I don't have time to explain this, but the Grand Canyon was formed very rapidly, not over millions and millions of years. When the great flood was receding and a great lake in the middle of what's now the United States drained, it caused that erosion very rapidly. It has to do with hydrodynamics. Most civilization, in Kiev, they produced Proton-21, produced in the laboratory, and they dated it very, very old, even though it was made just days before, using the potassium-argon method. No civilization that has any type of recorded history dates back more than 7,000 to 7,000 BC. The Indians, they date the beginning of existence at 6209. The ancient Arabian writings, 6174. Let's see, maybe the next slide. I don't remember if it's on there. Okay, before I get to those other dates, here's an actual picture of Mount St. Helens, and you see Mount Baker in the distance there. It's another volcano. There are all sorts of volcanoes. Mount St. Helens, Baker, Mount Hood in Oregon, across the border. Mount Rainier, which is up near Seattle. They're all volcanoes. Okay, next slide. Oh, here's an interesting thing. I visited a lot of caves. Going back to when I was a kid, my parents took us to Mammoth Cave and other caves, and they tell you that the stalactites, those are these that come from the ceiling, tight because they hold on tight, and the mites are at the bottom, the stalagmites, that these form over tens of thousands of years, and that they grow like an inch every 1,000 years or something like that. But here we have stalactites on some of the pipes that are in the cave. Next slide. Here we have the tour guide, dumbfounded, having a conflict between their script that they read to people that come in, and I've confronted the tour guides. I just love to do that when I go in a cave. Well, what about these stalactites here on this conduit that was put in like 20 years ago, that are supposedly 3,000 years old? Okay, they don't have an explanation because they've got a script they're supposed to read, and I don't know what they really believe. Okay, next. Raises a lot of questions. Go ahead to the next. Okay, we'll just hold there for a minute. So these ancient civilizations, the only one that has less than 5,000 years is the Mayans, and the Mayans had a calendar that went back to 3,113 years. So the ancient civilizations really are pretty much in sync with biblical creation timelines, going back to that DNA, and I'm not going to get into a full explanation, but they have collected samples from men all around the world, and they look at the Y chromosome, which mutates at a constant rate one generation to the next, and they've discovered that all human males can trace their ancestry back to 3 human males about 4,500 years ago. That's when Shem, Ham, and Japheth got off the ark. And that's not only true for humans, that's true for bears, dogs, cows, all the different species that were part of the kinds that were taken aboard the ark. Then for women, there's a mitochondrial DNA that's not in the nucleus, and they've taken samples, and they've spent like $20 billion doing this research all around the world. And all human females go back to one human female ancestor. And even the evolutionists call her Eve. They argue about how long ago that was, but the human males go back and the animals go back 4,500 years. And there's a bottleneck, and they're sort of dumbfounded. No, I had the Great Pyramid on there. Encyclopedia Britannica said it's 4,800 BC that it was built. Then 10 years later, they said, no, it's 3,800 years ago. Then they said it was 2,850 years, and then 2,600 years BC. They keep changing their mind. Now they're going back to an earlier date again. Okay, last page now. Here we have some famous frauds. The first one here is Lucy. Lucy was found in Africa, and they found skeletal remains. They needed a knee joint to prove that she walked upright, and they found one that was 200 feet lower and 2 miles away, and claimed that it belonged to this skeleton, Lucy. And they didn't really find any feet bones. Okay, so they put this story together, and this was breaking news not too many years ago. And here they've discovered another Lucy in another location. Another famous primitive man remains was Java Man. It was found on the island of Java in Indonesia, and it turned out that it was the partial skull of a man and the leg bone or arm bone of an orangutan. Then we have the Piltdown Man here. Piltdown Man, proven to be a hoax. He had an ape-like jaw and other animal bones that were put together and claimed to be a pre-human, earlier human type. They found that the teeth were filed down to make them look more like human teeth, and the jaw and other parts of the skull were stained to look older. Okay, this is a famous fraud. Even the evolutionists know that this was a fraud, but this was used in textbooks. I remember it being in textbooks when I was a kid. Nebraska Man. Okay, here's a drawing of Nebraska Man. They also had drawings of his family and the tools and his kids and so forth. The only piece of evidence that makes up Nebraska Man was a tooth. One tooth. And with DNA now, they've proven that it was a pig's tooth. Okay, next slide. This is the kind of evidence that they're passing off as. Now, when I was a kid, I went to the Museum of Natural History in Chicago, and these are drawings of the mannequins that they had in the museum that, would convince me as a kid that, well, yeah, maybe they were more primitive and so forth. And they depicted them this way. And the actual skulls of Neanderthals, which were real individuals, scientists know that they're human beings. Their skulls were actually bigger, and they had bigger brains than modern human beings. Next slide. If you take drawings of Neanderthals and you dress them up in modern clothing, they don't look any different than anybody else walking down the street. Next slide. Okay, next slide. Now here we have some Russian scientists that found a Neanderthal skull someplace in Siberia, and they're sitting there. This is from National Geographic magazine, and I actually have the whole magazine. They're trying to convince the readers that the drawing of the individual that they made from this skull is actually more primitive than modern humans, like themselves. I don't see a lot of difference. You know. Okay, next slide. Here we have Albert Einstein, who discovered that time is actually money. I don't know how much overtime I'm doing here. Can you bear with me just a little bit longer? The important thing is that he came up, next slide, with the theory of special relativity. And one of the things that's important too is E equals mc squared. Theory is that outer space is not empty. It has a vapor in it. He called it something else than a vapor, I forget now. And that vapor is affected by gravity. So you take the Earth and you have it in this fabric of space, it will bend the fabric. And in Genesis and in other places, in Job, we're told that God stretched out the heavens like a cloth. I don't have the quote exactly right, but he stretched it out. And that was before he put the stars and the planets and so forth in it. So the Earth actually bends this fabric. And what's interesting about that, it bends time. Proof of that is that in England, at Greenwich, England, there's an atomic clock that keeps very accurate time. And there's another one in Colorado, I think it's in Colorado Springs, at about 5,000 feet above sea level. And they started out the exact time, and the one in Colorado that's 5,000 feet higher, more time has passed on that clock. It's just microseconds. But if you go up into outer space, the further away you get from Earth, the faster the time has gone. They have to account for that with the GPS. If they didn't account for that, you'd be 5 miles off from your location as it shows up on your GPS on the phone or in the car. So the scientists do account for that time difference. And if you go millions of light years away, they could actually be 15 billion years old time-wise, while the Earth is 6,000 years or a little less old, because it's relative. I don't have time to completely explain that, but that's a scientific fact. Next slide. So a lot of people that believe in evolution just totally don't want to see the facts. Judy's laughing because I took this picture as we walked around in the mall. It was in one of the, or Millie, you remember that? We also had those mannequins without brains. Okay, next. Another criticism of the Bible is that, and this is not the Milky Way, this is the next closest, Andromeda, the next closest galaxy, a photo from one of the space telescopes. Our position, Earth, in our solar system is at the very edge of a galaxy, our galaxy, the Milky Way, which looks like this. And we're not at the center of the galaxy. The Bible says that the sun travels in its circuit. The Earth goes around the sun, so it's not talking about that, but it travels in its circuit. And critics of the Bible say, well, that's a big error. You know, those ancient Hebrews, they just made something up. That doesn't actually happen. But the astronomers know now that the sun does travel in a circuit in the Milky Way. It takes about I forget now. 250 million years to travel the whole circuit, but it is moving in a circuit, the whole solar system, the sun and all the planets, it is moving in a circuit, actually moves. So we're not going to see that, but they have measured that. Astronomers have measured that. Next one. Here, may I be excused? My brain is full. Okay, so we're at the end here, and next slide. Okay, Houston, we have a problem. Next slide. Okay, we have the truth of God's word. If you put on biblical glasses and have a biblical worldview, and we have the evolutionary perspective with evolutionary glasses. So it depends on your worldview. Okay, thank you for being patient with me, and I'll open it up now for any questions. We can stop the recording, but if anybody has any questions.